it became very clear that everyone had all our data. DiDi knew everything we were doing. Whereas like Lyft and Uber always knew what each other were doing because we were watching each other, we're friends, things like that. But like we never had each other's data. Like China, like they definitely had our data, like 100%. We were just like the Chinese government has it, DiDi has it, like everybody that wants to compete with us has it. It's like available readily in the market.
Adam, I am so excited for this. I heard so many good things from our wonderful mutual friend Josh Ellman, who said you'd be the best guest. So first, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Excited to be here.
I would love to start. Growth is this new discipline, and you've been in growth orgs in some incredible companies. We have Uber, Hotel Tonight, Masterclass. What was the entry into growth for you, Adam?
I mean, so I was in really digital marketing very early on, so almost 20 years ago. My first client ever was Sun Microsystems. And so we were doing, we were acquiring Java developers to make apps for phones that looked like candy bars at the time, not iPhones and things like that. And so really kind of grew up in this world of very data-centric marketing, where everything that we did could be measured and thought about. And inevitably, like my kind of path became this emerging media path where I'd helped clients understand, like, how do you leverage new technologies like social and mobile and video? And for a lot of those traditional clients, so Budweiser, JCPenney, et cetera, it was not just thinking about marketing, it was also thinking about the product. Like, how does the product need to evolve and be different? You can't just take what you had on your website and throw it on a mobile device or put it on Facebook or things like that. And so that to me is like, feels a lot like what I do as growth now, or like a precursor of it. But Uber was really the first place that we called it growth, right? I was hired by Ed Baker. He brought over the kind of Facebook structure that they had built at Facebook. And so that was the first time I had a title and thought of myself as part of a growth team instead of just a marketing team or part of the business.
Incredibly unfair start to the show, but I'm too interested. Growth. Is it an art or is it a science? You said there about data. I'm constantly erring between the two. How do you sit?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a mix of the two, right? Like the core of growth really dives into user psychology and understanding customers and making sure that you're actually connecting with people when the perceived value of your product or your offering is at its ultimate highest, and then building technology and building systems around that to, soak it up and actually be able to manipulate it and do it over and over and over and over and over again. So to me, that's the art is the people and the science is the data and machines and systems.
So we normally finish with a quick fire, but you have this incredible array of experiences from so many different companies that I was like, well, fuck it, let's start at the beginning with a quick fire too. Why not?
Let's do it.
Let's be wild. So if we start chronologically, your first growth role was Hotel Tonight. What was the biggest challenge and how did that experience impact your mindset?
Yeah, so Hotel Tonight, was a mobile-only travel app, and the relationship that we had with our hotels was one that the rates that we were marketing could only be done on mobile devices. It was a kind of a rule left out of a lot of the early paperwork with Expedia and the big traditional players. And that meant that we couldn't leverage SEO. And that's really how most travel companies had grown up into that point. And so that really forced us to be at the forefront of anything mobile growth, right? We were doing a lot of incentivized ads to jump up into the App Store. We were doing a lot of the, early versions of mobile referral programs with contact lists. It really just kind of honed in my ability to understand and think about new channels. And so, one of my happy moments to look back on is that I was working with the Facebook product team and was the first customer to use mobile ads on Facebook. And so actually being at that forefront, and the only reason we were able to do it is because we had a good brand and we weren't a mobile game. And so Facebook wanted a different example other than games kind of in that mix. And so, that kind of new channel ability and thinking outside of the SEO box for hotels was a really big opportunity for us.
Next, we have Uber, and I am being clinical on this. Normally I converse in some manner, but we're being clinical. Next, we have Uber. What was the biggest challenge, and how did that impact your mindset towards growth?
Yeah, so, I joined Uber. We had about a dozen cities, and when I left, we had probably 1,000 plus cities, or, the idea of cities kind of disappeared at some point. Really thinking about and driving growth, where growth really impacted both sides of the marketplace, and having to do it where the marketplace is hyper local and changes immediately, like every moment. Like the marketplace has a different dynamic. I think that just became like a master class, like an MBA in marketplaces, and really understanding the dynamics of like, okay, we're not just thinking about like customer acquisition. We have to think about how the relationship between the rider and driver, or the restaurant and the rider, or the trucker and the shipping company, and like really thinking about marketplaces, like was just a hardcore element of helping to grow Uber.
I mean, Lambda is an interesting one. Biggest challenge in the growth role at Lambda, and how did that change your mindset?
Yeah, so actually similar to Uber, where I started and like literally halfway through my interview, it was about how do we get more riders? Travis came in and was like, wait a minute, what about drivers? I had to like shift and think about it very differently. Lambda School is similar, where it was like, hey, how do we get more students into our school? And then we quickly realized that like Lambda lives and breathes on getting people jobs, not getting people into a school. And so we shifted all of our product and marketing work to the job placement side. And that was just this like unique moment where you've got all of these different customers using the exact same product. You have students, you have teachers, like getting them into that point. You have student coaches, you have salespeople, and you have the hiring managers. And so that like building product and growth around like just a hugely instrumental part of the company's success and like a complex moment was really enjoyable.
I think it's so important, actually, as you said that. I think so few people can isolate what is the single most important metric that defines their business. Like for me, it's the supply of high quality guests that I have on the show. It drives everything else. Mm-hmm. For you at Lambda there, it was, placements in jobs. I think so few founders can actually articulate that. Final one, biggest challenge in the role at Masterclass, and how did that impact your mindset?
Yeah, so I was at Masterclass, right after a couple big things hit. So one, Apple really kind of cut Facebook's knees off and made, hyper targeting ads really difficult suddenly. And that was really the bread and butter of how Masterclass grew for a long time. People started going outside again post-COVID. And Masterclass kind of hit this inflection point where a single instructor was no longer this like, oh, wow, that's crazy. You've got that instructor on there anymore, because all of the instructors they had were that. And so we had to shift from, hey, how do we take a single instructor and market them and leverage them to get somebody in and using our product, to really thinking about the value of the portfolio of Masterclass and the entire subscription. And so Masterclass just became this like hardcore element of how do we think about engagement and how do we think of like the portfolio value of our product, and really shifting that awareness of our product to the customer that we're working with.
I'm too interested. I always think with Masterclass, they must just grow insanely because of the distribution channels of the talent, whether it's Serena Williams or Gordon Ramsay. To what extent do new customers come, or from when you were there, from those distribution channels of the talent versus the company and the product?
It was pretty mixed. I would say the majority still comes from Masterclass first. The kickoff moment, I think a lot about launching a class at Masterclass similar to like trying to get on the New York Times bestseller list, where you use the leverage of that talent to hit that spark right out of the gate to get the biggest audience in like one fell swoop. And so that's where that talent's network would really come in handy. We also had the ability to do like white labeling and things like that, right? Where we're able to leverage Gordon Ramsay's Facebook page to do marketing and that type of stuff, which was definitely an advantage that a lot of companies don't have. But I would say that burst at the beginning was valuable, but you still got a lot more value over the course of time from an individual class than just that moment at launch.
Fascinating. Perception and reality, baby. Listen, I want to dive into a definition, because growth is such an overused term and so confused. What does the role of head of growth and growth CMO mean to you, Adam?
Yeah, so two very different things in my mind. I'm on a bit of a high horse right now about this idea of a growth CMO. And so let's just talk marketing for a second. So when we think about marketing and building marketing teams, I find so many companies get stuck in this trap of, do I want like a performance-driven CMO or do I want a brand-driven CMO? And what I believe that does is infuses this idea that you actually have to think about those two things like wildly different. Where when I think about growth, whether it's a head of growth or a growth CMO or whatever, it's more about, the art of understanding how to leverage all of the data, all of the flexibility of like the real world economics of our world that we live in now, and technology, and actually be able to implement that. And to me, that's not only valuable for paid ads, right, or SEO. It's also valuable for how you think about the design of your business and your brand and the story you're telling and the content you're creating. And so to me, a growth CMO is actually like a full stack CMO, but actually leverages the idea of, hey, let's bring in data, experimentation, and product and engineering to help us drive the entire system, everything from your performance media to brand and PR on the other end of the spectrum.
So I totally agree with you. And again, this is where the joy of shake you off schedule. And I was having this conversation with the founder the other day. The truth is, they are unicorns, those that get the brand, the story, the resonating with consumers versus the data-centric, very analytical. They're very rare to come together. So is it even possible to have that growth CMO? And for founders, like, should they not just go for one or the other, bluntly?
I think so. I think it's a matter of knowing where your strengths are and how you operationalize it, right? So I think having the value of a like a killer brand person on your team is incredibly high. Like, I don't disvalue brand. If anything, I like, I'm a marketer, right? I studied marketing. I've been in advertising and marketing my whole life. And so like the idea of brand and the value of comms, content, all of those things is very high. But I think they are still operated in a very traditional model that was happening 20 years ago and should be operated more like a brand team is operating things, where you're driving with experimentation and data and building product to build your brand. And so to me, just like with any role, whether it's product or marketing or engineering, you tend to have a T. And I think, finding that person that is going to have either a brand base, but can start to learn the breadth of growth, or a performance base, and understand how growth and performance can be applied to brand. They're never going to be, to your point, both of those things in one. And so, yes, I agree that you're going to have to hire somebody that has a base. But I believe that there's this fundamental shift in mindset of that doesn't mean you have to operate those sides of the business wildly different from one another.
I agree, especially in terms of that kind of intersection at the T. We're going to get to uncovering qualities, but in terms of the structure itself, how do you think about, where a growth team sits within an org, especially given that kind of holistic view of a CMO growth?
Generally speaking, I actually don't think most companies need a growth team. Growth, again, should be infused throughout the business. So quick story in terms of Uber, right? I was hired by Ed. We formed the growth team, and we were already, we just got funding from Google. We were already a $2 billion company, right? We had 300 employees. Most of those were ops people, at the city level. But so let's say it was a 75 to 100 person kind of centralized engineering driven organization. But we had massive product market fit. It was very, very obvious at that point. We built this growth team because the core product team was knee deep in trying to figure out how to grow our product. The core product, we needed someone to be able to focus on growth. That quickly evolved into two different growth teams with Rider and Driver, and then an international growth team, a China growth team, and then eventually it disappeared. So we actually, all of those functions within the growth team eventually actually merged back into the core business, to where by the time I left, we actually didn't have a centralized growth team anymore. And I think people assume that Uber succeeded because they had a growth team, pre-seed and built it out, and they still have it and it's working magic and all this kind of stuff. It's no, most of the functions within growth for a normal growing company can actually just be built appropriately within their associated teams, within marketing, having performance marketing, within product, having people owning the top of the funnel acquisition or activation, retention, engagement. So most companies actually don't need a standalone growth team.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just intrigued. Do you not think, so I totally get you, but when you have marketing, when you have product, when you have all the different functions, their sole priority isn't always growth or net new users or whatever we want to decide is our growth model. And it's actually a lot of other things. And so it actually gets deprioritized. I guess my question to you is, how do you infuse growth as a priority when you don't have a growth team?
I've never actually been on a product or a marketing team that didn't care about growing their business, even if it didn't have the title growth. So I think this idea that there are teams and companies that don't, like within companies that don't care about growing their business is a fallacy. I think the real risk is it being deprioritized for like noise, right? Or whatever the hottest thing in the market is right now, or something's broken, so we have to fix that. To me, I think that like building a growth, so if you do build a growth team, right, I think there's the element of having a strike team nature to it, a full stack team with product, with marketing, with design, with data, with engineering that can go and dive deep into like whatever the core point of leverage for your business to grow right now. Maybe that's acquisition, but it's like once you're done with that, like it's not like you stop doing acquisition, or maybe it's activation, or maybe it's a referral program, or maybe it's whatever it could be. Like anything that's good and worth it has to keep getting worked on. And the way you build a growth team is typically not the right DNA of people to just keep working on those things. And so I think that like this idea that like you have to have a piece of the business carved out and that's only thinking about growth, to me, just I think that's where a lot of people get stuck and have trouble churning through heads of growth or being like, oh my gosh, where should this sit? While the core product leader and marketing leader are like, we're doing the work right now. Why do you think we need another person? Like it feels very reactive to thinking you need growth, rather than I think the best growth teams, like standalone growth teams, come from when you have hypergrowth and you need to like control it and contain it and understand it. Like that's when I think a focused growth team is like, hey, figure out what's happening here and how we can like productize this and keep it growing and make sure it's not just like a flash in the pan.
Okay, so now, I mean, you've thrown my schedule into complete mayhem.
It still works. I think there's still value there, but I'll probably come back to that a couple times. That I think that especially early stage companies thinking, oh my God, I need a head of growth, I think is a very like risky proposition.
Do you think hiring heads of growth too early is the biggest mistake founders make?
Yes. Yeah, I would say so. Because again, I think that founders are like, we're not growing fast enough. I should hire a head of growth. And if you're not growing fast enough, it's usually because you don't have product market fit. And it's like, you actually need to improve your product first. And like, yeah, still grow, but you're looking for hacky ways to grow your business that actually isn't working in the marketplace yet.
So let's take this, like, actually growth is a mindset. It may not be like a role or a function. It could be, but it may not be. If we think about hiring processes, Adam, you've hired many people and many great people. How do you structure hiring processes today? And if you were advising me a hypothetical angel investment of yours, how would you advise me on how to structure a hiring process for someone with a growth mindset?
Yeah, so I think scoping it is the first stage, right? So let's look at what team do you have right now, and let's say what do we want the team to be, say a year from now? What do we if we grow the way we think we're going to grow by hiring this person, like what team and functions do we think we actually need? So one of the challenges I see a lot of people do is they'll hire one growth person, and like as I mentioned, like when we built growth at Uber, like we infused an entire team in one fell swoop, right? Like Ed was hired, and he hired myself, a head of product, a head of engineering, a head of design, a head of analytics. And like, so we each were like operating our own individual functions and able to grow as a group, not just, hey, Ed now has to go and like barter and trade to get resources from the rest of the organization. So I think that mapping of saying like, okay, let's say this like really works, and we're making the investment in growth as a standalone thing. Like, what does it look like a year from now? And in that process, I think that's where people really often realize that like, oh, it's what we actually need is someone to really think about our acquisition and activation funnel. And maybe that is really just a growth product person that sits within the product organization that is thinking about those elements of the team. And so I think that exercise of like thinking through a year and scoping it out can help you really understand of like, do you really actually want this third party team like operating independently of your growth and marketing teams a year from now, and like what does that even look like? And that's where most people are like, oh, I'd actually rather this be embedded here and here. So maybe you still hire a growth person, but like hire them, be like, hey, do this hacked together growth team for 6 months. But the goal is actually for you to land as one of our senior product managers on the product organization where you're going to run this. And then by the time that happens, we're also going to have a head of marketing. And so maybe that's where performance marketing will sit. And again, all of that could change in those 6 months. But those exercises to me help you actually, one, have a realistic conversation with yourself of what growth needs to do for your organization, and then scope it and have the right conversations with people when you actually go to market and start recruiting.
I had Mike Dubois on from Greylock recently, who was at growth at Stitch Fix, and he said that for the first growth hire or first growth mindset, really kind of central person that you bring on with growth at the core, you want an analyst mind, someone who actually can create the foundations from data in particular. When you think about the type of person that you want as that first growth mindset, they could be in product, they could be wherever in the org. What type of person do we want?
I agree with that. I think having a very data-minded person is important. I don't think they have to be an analyst. Like, I think of myself as somebody that like wields data really, really, really well, but I'm not creating like media mix models and, like hardcore modeling, but I know how to like dig into it and read it and understand it, ask the right questions, propose the right things to my teams, or go find the right resources to build it. And so I agree wholeheartedly, though, that like the foundation of growth tends to be experimentation. And like really great experimentation takes a very data-driven mindset. And so I think having a very data-driven person is important. And then I think it's a matter of like, what else do you have in the business? Like if you don't have anybody that like really understands customers, then I think having somebody maybe with a bit more of a marketing or like a product management experience is helpful. If you do, but like you need to build a bunch of technology, then like somebody that's maybe more technical and has more of an engineering mindset to flavor that is valuable.
What are your favorite questions to ask to tease out whether I have that growth mindset? What questions really reveal that ability?
Probably the two most common. So one is I have an exercise that is like came from Uber, which is how do you determine what you're willing to pay for a rider or a driver in any given market, which is like a very complex marketplace. Go ahead, answer it. Do you know the answer?
I would answer, well, I would look at the existing cohorts and then I would look at the LTVs on a per rider basis, and that will tell me how much I'm willing to pay on a customer acquisition basis.
So the challenge is that the LTV is usually based on the value of a trip, but that value of a trip has a shared relationship between the rider and the driver. And so you have to decide like the revenue that you get from that trip. If you're getting 20% revenue from a $10 trip, you're giving that $2 to calculate the lifetime value of the rider or the lifetime value of the driver?
No, the rider. The rider. The driver's doing many trips, right? So they have a higher LTV. Right?
Exactly. So we could probably spend another 30 minutes going back and forth on this, but it just becomes a very complicated answer because it is both, right? Like you ultimately have to decide when you're marketing to both of those customers, when I have to pay to go get a rider and I have to pay to go get a driver, I have to calculate both of their LTV. So I can't just give it to one side of the marketplace. But then you have a dynamic where like some markets you need more riders, some markets you need more drivers. So you may be willing to pull more of the value over to the rider or more of the value over to the driver. And so it just gets like really complex. And there's like, this is one of those challenges that like we had like dozens of data scientists working with it and we never got a great answer to it. But like just hearing how people think through that and like challenge and push, oh, okay, I see that. I think to me like really highlights the ability again to wield data, to be able to think through like the complexities of it, not just take another model that you heard somewhere else and apply it to something you've never, like most people haven't thought about that specific problem.
What was the other question?
So the other question is, I like to dive into engagement because a lot of people in growth like to think about acquisition. And so I typically give some type of product where I'm like, look, we've actually got like really good, consistent engagement, but now we want to grow engagement of these users. So I want you to think through examples of, how could we get, new customers engaged? How can we get like more frequent engagement? And how can we get more quality engagement? Like come up with examples or how you would test each of those. And then usually I go go through kind of let's think of this like a product manager. Like, how would you prioritize those? How would you like pull in the resources to test? Like, how would you test those? And how would you pull in those resources? And so I find that gets the double hit of how do you think about the real customer need, like down funnel, not just at the top of the funnel. And how do you think about like actually operating these types of experiments that aren't just like running ads or running landing page tests?
With both of those questions, I think it's often for founders listening, it's quite helpful to know like the red flags, like the glaring, oh shit, they shouldn't have said that, because there's not always a particular right answer, but there is sometimes a wrong. What are the red flags that come with those?
So the biggest one for me, and this is very much my marketing hat showing, is people that just don't talk about the customer and like what is the actual customer problem and how are we solving it and what's the value of it, when they just are like, all we're going to think about is the data. Or again, just pulling in like, oh, here is how I did it exactly at this company, where it's like just copying and pasting what you did at a previous company is to me just like a red flag of like someone taught you how to do this rather than you actually having the framework in your head to go apply it to the unique nature of my business and my customer. And so those to me are just big red flags that I see. I run into a lot with people that I find to be, could be really great talent to have on a team, but are often more suited for like a very specific role, like that has like a very actionable, like go get this thing done. It's very directed to you versus a growth role, which I think is like a very like pioneer exploratory role.
Do you give them case studies or tests? And if you do give them tangible case studies or tests, do you make them do it like there and then, or do they have some time to go away with it?
I'll usually start that. Like the first example I gave you, I'll usually just kind of do live because, like I said, it's more about I want to hear how you think through it than I want to see if you can get the right answer. Whereas the latter one is a case. So it's more of a, hey, here, I really loved our phone conversation. Do this exercise. Get back to me in a week, and then we'll like figure out next steps.
In terms of like packages, how do growth like minded packages for people with growth? It's a weird. I'm gonna use this. Fuck it, I'm British. Anyway, it's a great excuse for anything. You're like, fuck it, I'm British. Right. But like, do packages vary for these growth centric roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think your product bands are usually a really good place to start. They, on like the performance growth marketing side of things, you tend to have like the good people in that market have a lot more leverage. And so I think product bands tend to be more appropriate. And then it just becomes like how unique and how important is it to that business. And, like I've talked a lot about marketplaces, and, there aren't that many people that have hey, I've actually dealt with highly complex marketplaces, things like that. Same with B2B, right? Like I think you talked to Elena, right? Like she's got like honed in the B2B, like growth stack down. And it's just like, okay, I know I can bring this person on and like move twice as fast as anybody else on this like very specific thing. And so I think then that just, becomes part of your equation of, do you put a multiple on that core kind of product bands that you're looking at?
We mentioned the question around kind of Uber there, and how do you price what you will be willing to pay for that rider? I think we mentioned North Star earlier and the importance of it. When you speak with founders and advise your founders today, how do you determine what North Star metric that a founder should choose? How do you advise them on what to choose and how they should decide it?
I like to look for a couple things. So one is like, what is something that can rally as much of the company as humanly possible, right? Like, so you could say something like new customers is our North Star. But, there's huge chunks of the business that really are like, whatever, we're going to do our job, whether we get 10x the same number of people or like we slow down, like the job is exactly the same in front of us. I also think that, when you're dealing with marketplaces, like having a metric that actually forces you to think through which side of the market needs more growth or more effort. So at Uber, I think you and Ed talked about this around like the like trips was our metric, because it's like, okay, well, a trip can't happen without a rider and a driver. And so if trips slow down, it forces us to go into the weeds and say like, well, why aren't they happening? Is it pricing? Is it the amount of riders in the market? Is it the amount of drivers in the market? Is it where they're going? Like, it just forces you to ask more thoughtful questions. And then the last thing I like to think of is like actually rooting it to the customer problem. A lot of Silicon Valley uses like DAUs or MAUs or things like that, but most people don't actually use those products. Like, the problem that their products solve doesn't happen daily or weekly or monthly. It actually has like once every 3 weeks or 2 times every 6 months. Like, Masterclass isn't like, when you're in a class, it's maybe a daily active, but then you're maybe going to take 3 classes a year, right? You're not going to take another class the second you're done with the first class, and then the third class and the fourth class. And so actually rooting it to like, how is the customer, like, what are they coming here to solve? To me, that as a North Star metric, make sure that you're thinking about like the actual engagement and retention elements of your business appropriately as well.
I like that in terms of like what touches the most amount of people being that metric. I guess my question next is like, when we think about growth models aligned to North Star metrics, how do you define, because growth models is kind of thrown around quite a lot, how do you define what really is a growth model, and whose job is it to make it? And how do you think about advising founders on constructing theirs?
I think this is another one that can be a trap for some people, in the sense of, I have to have a really, really crazy, well-defined model and everything structured around it. Primarily because like everything changes so quickly, especially for early stage founders. That being said, like, what I typically like to do with my founders is create what I think of as like a vanilla model of just like, hey, are you going to grow? Here's like the 4-step process that you're going to grow. You're going to get more customers. They're going to create a piece of content. That content is something they're going to share with a friend. That friend like loves the content so much that they want to become a customer. So they share. So it's like, great. I've created some like 4-step loop. And I like using that then as an anchor for 2 major things. So one is, do you actually connect the dots, right? Do they come back full circle? Do the things that your customers do on your platform give a reason for the next person to actually become a customer? If not, then like you're growing a linear business, which is fine, and like there are a lot of very successful linear businesses, but like know that you actually are going to have to probably do more paid or do more like really traditional top of funnel, just getting customer sales motions, things like that. The other piece is it gives you like 4 like concrete elements that like every planning meeting you go into, every like prioritization meeting you have, you'd be like, is this actually impacting one of those 4 things? And if it's not, like, this probably isn't helping our business right now. I'm, a hardcore user of Reforge and been an instructor there and things like that. So like, I say all of this not because I don't think all of the modeling and building those tools and like going through those exercises aren't valuable. I think people can just go through it so much that they overcomplicate themselves and actually miss just the most obvious actionable things that they could be doing. So if you want to like get hardcore into growth models, go dig into the Reforge content. Like that'll explain how to create a model better than I am. But I think just a simple loop of your business to start is like a really great, healthy way to anchor around like all of the efforts that you're doing, and to make sure you actually know whether or not your business has a K factor or not.
I have to ask this. I've been dying to ask it since the beginning. But you're the master of marketplaces, having worked in some of the best. I had Jeff Jordan on the show recently. He obviously was at Open Table, and the truth is, he was like, we look for fragmented supply sides and how brilliant fragmented supply sides are. And then I hear a lot of VCs be like, well, it's super hard to acquire, it's super hard to retain, it takes a long time with lots of like little suppliers. But then if we flip it and you have a concentrated supply base, you have concentration risk. That's very dangerous. You could lose 20% of your supply with one customer. And so my question to you is, I guess you've seen both with Uber and Masterclass, where I guess supply is more concentrated than say an Uber. What's easier to run, the concentrated supply base or the fragmented?
Easier to run is the concentrated. I find it incredibly more fun to run the distributed like long tail supply. Yeah, that's my one short answer
Can I ask,
you get today.
Yeah, I like that. I just have to ask. Driver growth is really, really hard. What do you think you did so well at Uber to accommodate the demand on the supply side? Like, how did you acquire drivers so efficiently, do you think?
I mean, it wasn't one thing, right? Like, it was dozens and dozens of things. So just a couple quick ones. So one was like new channel discovery, right? Like the idea of onboarding and acquiring hundreds of thousands, millions of drivers is something no one's ever done before, right? There's no case study. Like there's some learnings in trucking or in like UPS, or, there's some elements in terms of like people that want to make more money. So you can take some learnings from like University of Phoenix and things like that. And like, so there's case studies on like how to do some stuff, but there was no just like, hey, here's how X company did it. You can go do it as well. And so literally like every other week we'd be like, okay, we were just spending time with our ops team and they post stuff on Craigslist to get drivers to show up at our office to sign up. Could we automate that? Could we actually take that into our growth team and like make it like a scalable channel? Craigslist works. Like, wouldn't all job boards work? And like we had to go into like Indeed and Monster, and actually like they're used to posting like 2 jobs at a time. We're like, no, we want hundreds of jobs for every category. We want to treat it like Google, not like a job classifieds, right? So just like constantly iterating and thinking through like, hey, we actually have to just be the snowplow here and go and find and create and identify ways to like get drivers on board. I think the second thing was just really understanding, like taking the time to do just tons of customer research. Drivers is such a broad array of people, right? You have people that are professional drivers already, like taxi drivers, things like that just shifted their work effort over to Uber. You had people that were like, hey, I'm doing like odds and ends jobs as it is. I'll just add this to my mix. You have people that weren't working. They're maybe like stay-at-home moms or had a schedule that they just are like, oh man, having one more thing to like plug the hole in. You have retirees that are like, I just want to talk to people. I want to hang out with people. And like really understanding those, because initially we were able to just go market the heck out of like, hey, you can make $1,000 a week, right? Like, okay, everybody wants that, but eventually like that's not enough to build trust for someone to be comfortable with someone in the back of their car, or for that retiree, like the $1,000 a month isn't like that interesting. It's actually like the communicating, the engaging with people, getting to know your city, things like that. And so having this, just like we brought on customer research onto our growth team really early on, and was just constantly doing cycles of like, how do we unlock that new fragmented piece of our marketplace?
On the flip side, I'm just too interested. Did you ever do a growth experiment which just totally flopped on the driver acquisition supply side at Uber?
Oh, I'm sure like 75% of them, right?
Which one's the most memorable? Where it's play. Oh.
Yeah, so when you would interview drivers who've been on the platform for a while, the thing that they would always say was that they don't actually drive for the money, they drive for the flexibility, right? Like the flexibility, when stack ranked, like money was like number 3. The flexibility, the ability to just like literally turn on my phone and I can go make money right now. Like I've never had anything that easy, that accessible. So I can fit that into whatever else is going on in my life. And so we took that insight and just we're like, great, we need to like shift all of our messaging away from dollars to flexibility. And we spent a ton of money on that type of messaging, and then it just burned, right? Like it was just like no one clicked, right? Like, and so what we learned is that like the messaging, like the point of time for the messaging really mattered. The money was the thing that got people being like, oh, that's interesting, I'll go click on that. Whereas the flexibility became more of an engagement strategy. And so like taking an insight from like your active customer and applying it to new customers was just like a big miss for us on like the marketing and messaging side of things.
What does that teach you for founders? Because like that's really confusing. If you do research groups, if you're a founder and they say, oh, I love the flexibility. Totally right. You would market the flexibility. So should you not do the research group? Should you not listen to it? Like...
Yeah, I think you should. I think you should just like, you have to be like really thoughtful about who you're researching and like who you're researching and where do you want to apply that research. If I'm researching and I'm interviewing people that are active customers and I'm going to go apply that research to inactive customers, like I can't assume that the same insight is going to stand and work to the same degree.
Can I ask, how do you, I am totally going off schedule, but I'm just too
No,
interested.
it's all right.
You mentioned the variant of drivers there, and I'm applying this more broadly now across just like horizontal customer bases. How do you market to horizontal customer bases when there's old people wanting to chat, mothers wanting more money or fathers wanting more money on the side of, life, and then full-time drivers? They're so different. Do you choose one and message for one, or do you try catch all and message for many?
Both. So, like, I typically try to build some type of like pyramid messaging structure that on the bottom of the pyramid, like the broad stuff is you can make money, right? Like, okay, that might still apply to that retiree. That might still apply to both men and women, things like that. And that I can kind of put into mass mediums, right? I could put that on my on Uber.com. I could put that in TV ads, things like that. Then the next tier up might be like something more specific. So let's take like safety and targeting female audiences, right? And so it's like, okay, we know that like women, another very large group, but gets a bit more specific. Safety really resonates there. So now I might take those channels and like put that message in. I may still be on TV, but now I may not target like sports, right? Like I may negative target things that I know are going to be very male skewed or things like that. Or I might like I'm going to put the right talent in there that actually speaks to my customer. I'm going to put that on, it may not be on Uber.com, but maybe there's a new badge on Uber.com that says learn about safety, and like it goes down that path, right? Then it may be like, what about like safety in Chicago? Right, where it's like, oh, like there's like we're seeing that safety matters more in Chicago than any other market. I lived in Chicago for a long time, so I'm picking it not because I think of it as a inherently dangerous city, but let's just say that's a thing, right? So it's like, again, you may build content around that, but now you're going to find channels that are like very specific to Chicago and that message hitting there. And so ideally, you want to build a structure that allows you to put the right message at the right place, and the better that targeting can be, the more refined the messaging can be. And ultimately, like, you just have to figure out like, okay, safety is a pillar that we can tackle, but like safety for retirees in Boca Raton is probably something that like there's just not enough market there for us to like build an entire creative flow for that. Right. And so there's like, creating different profiles and segments and like all that type of work that can help you decide like what is that right hierarchy and how do you deploy it.
How long do you leave a message out before you know whether it's worked or not? Like, is it instantaneous where you're like, oh, this isn't working? Or does it actually take some time where you need more data to understand the true effectiveness?
Yeah. So, I mean, the data matters, right? So at Uber, we can learn pretty quickly. I mean, we were spending $1 billion a year at one point. And so for me to test something in the ads layer, I could get learnings within minutes, right?
And so
whereas like,
would you pull it then in minutes if it saw nothing and you were like,
potentially, if it was like if it like most of the time we were again building like creative systems. And so it was just like, hey, we're going to actually test 50 different messages now within this creative system within a week, rather than just testing one thing for a week, then having to test the next thing. We had the volume that we could test like a ton of different things at once. And so rather than putting all those impressions against one message, we could like, separate it and actually get, a lot more insight and learnings into the direction we were going. Whereas like Lambda School, right? Like you think of the funnel for Lambda School starts with acquiring a student, then they go through an admissions process, then they're a student for 9 to 12 months, then you're interviewing for a couple months, then they get a job. So it's literally like a year-long funnel before you know if something really genuinely worked. And the volumes we were talking about are like 100 people in a class, a couple hundred people in a class, right? So we were spending maybe like $100,000 a month, right? Or not like just tons and tons of money. And so that cycle became like, okay, let's try to find signals. Let's pull in a lot more qualitative research, right? Let's talk to the students, see if they like, how do they reflect with that messaging? Do they think it's going to work? And that just naturally would be more of that environment where like, we're going to test one thing for the next 3 weeks, see if we can get enough signal in it to keep investing in it. So it can range pretty drastically.
I think a big thing that founders often struggle with is like understanding what is a retained user and what is true retention. When you think back to like Uber, it's kind of probably easier than say like a Lambda, but like when you think back to Uber, how did you define a retained user and how do you advise founders on what they should define a retained user as?
I think cohorting is really, really, really important when thinking about retention. I think a lot of times people get stuck in just looking at our monthly actives going up and things like that, and like really looking at, different cohorts, either on like a weekly or monthly basis. And then again, going back to like, what is the use case? Like, what is the problem that you're solving? And what is the natural use case of that problem? And so at Uber, if I took a segment that I knew were commuters, where I'm like, I would expect these people to, this cohort in this segment, to use our product 3 times a week. Like maybe not every single trip, but they're going to use it 3 times a week. Like we'll pull in enough data to do that analysis. We'll do some like histograms to understand like what is the normal, like the average, and then using that against that cohort to see like, okay, does that 3 trips a week, is it happening regularly month over month or week over week? And then that gives you both the, okay, this is a retained user, and it gives you the anchor to say like, oh, if they drop down to 2 or drop down to 1 a week, then that's someone I could actually start engaging with now in a way that's, you don't want to have to try to like recapture a user that's totally churned. You want to see someone like, okay, they're looking like they're going to churn, so what's our strategy for those people? Or are they now using it like 10 times a week? Like, okay, they're now in a totally different segment, so I can move them somewhere else.
Whose responsibility is that? Capturing someone who is potentially churning. Is that products? Is that marketing's within this growth-minded person within the org, where we don't have a growth team thanks to your advice, Adam?
I mean, if we don't have a growth team, it's I think that's where your data team is like really responsible for understanding like you should have a suite of metrics that are your growth metrics that can be leveraged by a variety of different teams, right? And so that, to me, typically as a data owner or like your VP of data, something like that, to be able to provide, like, ideally you want data to not be a reactive part of your team. You want it to be a proactive part of your team. So every week, data should be bringing insights to your product and marketing org, saying like, here's a strategy on how we can get more more engagement, more value out of each of our customers. Or the opposite being like, hey, I want to work on engagement. Data team, let's work together to like build out a model to help us understand like who are the audiences that we should be tackling, because I as a marketing team might want to do that with email right now, or I might want to do that with messaging in the app, or I might want to do that with an event for our customers, whereas product might be like, hey, we're going in and we're going to be working on the discovery element of our website. So like, or our app or ETAs or something like that. And we think it'll impact engagement. Like, let's work into that. So that's where I feel like data becomes like a really great anchor for growth to be infused throughout the organization.
Adam, you mentioned a word there, insight. And I often hear about post-mortems. And I think, well, no one really talks about like how often to do them and everything around it. So do you do post-mortems? How often? Who's invited? Who sets the agenda? Can you help me understand the right way to do post-mortems?
Yeah, so the right way and the way I've done it are probably 2 different things. So the right way is, you're ideally doing them with every sprint, and there's some type of just like regularity to them. The nature of a lot of, the business, I've worked with a lot of early stage companies, and it tends to be that postmortems happen when something breaks, right? It's actually like, hey, we should probably figure out what just happened there because something went terribly wrong. But again, good like post-mortem health would say that you're actually doing it every time. So you're also identifying the things that are working and all of those types of things. And so, but hey, something went wrong, let's do a post-mortem. Typically, like, there's some really great, like, on Miro and Coda, there's some good just basic templates that you can use. And I think typically it's figuring out who the right stakeholders are. So one example is at Lambda School, we implemented a new like chat opportunity for our students, and we didn't loop in customer service, and customer service had like an entirely different chat element. And so it just like caused a ton of backlash like across the company, because it was like, hey, we got good data out of this, but like we totally like, I like to call it owning your collateral damage. So it's like everything you do is probably going to have collateral damage. Go like find out what it is, go embrace those teams. Like ideally you tell them ahead of time, you get their buy-in ahead of time and things like that. But sometimes I think that's where postmortems come in handy to say like, hey, we misstepped. We're owning that. We would like you to come in and help us like break this down, but doing it with one of those templates and coming in with hey, we're going to all share in an honest fashion here. And the goal isn't to point fingers, but is actually to like allow us to do that same thing again, not prevent us from doing that thing again. I think that mindset can really help a post-mortem be more effective.
Man, I thought about it when you said about Ed Baker hiring you and then having like individual functions within a growth team. I'm like, wow, I bet the other functions within the org loved you guys.
Oh, it ranged, right? Like my biggest challenge were the operations teams, because you had like every city team would build like a small operations team, including marketing. And so we would get like, at any given time, there were probably like 200 personal credit cards buying ads on Facebook. And it used to drive me mad. And like initially I went out with like a very like firm grip on like, you can't do that. Like, stop doing that. Like, we have it structured over here. It's tagged appropriately. You're bidding against ourselves. Like a very like just authoritarian kind of view on it. And it just never stopped. And so like eventually I like shifted that into I need to actually build for those teams. Otherwise they're going to keep doing this. And like, I actually need them, right? Like, they understand their cities and these dynamics way better than I do because they're on the ground. And so like, we actually built like a function within our team to like work directly with cities and that type of stuff. And then I know product and data had those same challenges as well.
Why are they using personal credit cards?
Autonomy and go fight to win was very much part of our culture at Uber. And so if you're a GM for market, and you hire a marketer and you're like, man, this central team's doing marketing that's not quite what we need. Like a good example are like Outside Lands or Lollapalooza or Coachella, where I, as a global marketer, I'm not really building content for Coachella. Like, I don't really care. That's not for me. That's like 1 week. It's not going to, like, I can buy more efficiently when I think much broader Bay Area, right? Whereas like for the SF areas, like our entire marketplace is going to be screwed for a week. I want to go do specific marketing for that. And to me as a global buyer, my initial view on that is like, you're going to spend $10,000 of our $1 billion budget and putting like 3 people full time on that. That is a waste of our time, right? Like, that is not a good use of our time. But like, that was the culture, was to go do that because their goal was to get San Francisco to work, right? To win San Francisco. And so eventually, like, we had to come to terms. It's just like, oh, okay, maybe I could build things that allow you to do Coachella. Like, hey, it looks like every city does a major concert. So like, maybe we build like our own internal templates on how to buy that. So I reduce the noise hitting my team and I improve the effectiveness of what they're doing at the local level. Like, that's net good for the business.
That's a hard problem.
It's very hard.
You mentioned there the $1 billion ad spend.
A lot of gray hair from that problem.
You look wonderfully young. I am younger than you, but I look incredibly older. Tell me, you mentioned the $1 billion spend there. I think paid is really, really hard. When you think about the ratio between paid and organic, how do you think about advising founders?
So ultimately, like, you want to make paid a tool, not a crutch, right? You want it to be something that you can add fuel when you need that fuel, whether that's because you're Zoom and there was a pandemic and you're like, oh crap, like, we need to go win the market right now, like, move as fast as possible, just dump all of our money into the next 6 weeks because it will be more effective now than ever before. In that moment, you should probably be willing to make it like 90%, right? But I also like, you shouldn't, to have like a refined tool, you also don't want it to be 0% necessarily, because you're going to miss those moments if you're like not operating it at all. So from like a generic, I'm going to just give you an answer. Like, I usually tell people 30% tells me that you're not dependent on paid, and it tells me that you're doing it enough to have like a need to keep refining and improving it, being relevant in the moment and those types of things. And by giving that anchor of 30%, it starts to allow people to be uncomfortable when it's above 30%, right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't go there, but you should start to get uncomfortable. If it's like, man, we're spending way too much money. When you've put that anchor at 30, it allows you to at least say like, how much is too much, rather than just saying like, oh, this feels off.
What did the split look like at Uber? Because you've got like product-led growth tactics, like referrals, especially within Uber, and like discount codes. You've also got paid. You've got word of mouth, natural. You know, Uber in the early days, your amazing car showed up outside, and everyone's like, "Ooh, how did that get there?" What did the mix look like in terms of those different acquisition strategies?
So we probably floated around 50% when we were hitting that. Like, so when we were doing $1 billion, that included China, and that was more than 50%. Like, paid drove a ton of our growth in China. And it was it was nonsense. It was just wild. And so like, let's say $600-700 million on like the rest of the world to market Uber. That was probably accounting for 40 to 50% of our growth at any given time. Now it's probably way more efficient than that. They pulled back significantly. Like we started to there, like my 4th year at Uber, we started pulling back quite a bit.
Sorry, I'm too. I've never been to China. I don't know the Chinese. What was so wild about it?
Well, so one, none of the channels that we've used are there, right? So like, oh, we've been using Facebook and Google and all these job boards, and like none of them exist in China. So you literally had to take like everything you know about media buying and planning and marketing and like throw it out the window, go understand and learn that market, and then like figure out how to do all of the different channels there. So for instance, the App Store is a much more distributed world there, right? It's not just like, hey, drive everything to Apple. It's like, oh, you actually need to go buy relationships with various different app stores to be able to be there and to be discovered there. When we would hire like agencies and things like that, it became very clear that everyone had all our data. So like DiDi knew everything we were doing. Whereas like Lyft and Uber always knew what each other were doing because we were watching each other, we're friends, things like that. But like we never had each other's data. Like China, like they definitely had our data, like 100%. We were just like the Chinese government has it, DiDi has it, like everybody that wants to compete with us has it. It's like available readily in the market for us.
Did you have their data?
We didn't. As far as I know, we didn't. I didn't have their data. But we would like have like Zoom calls, and then just like random phone numbers would just show up on our Zoom calls, and we'd be like, oh, we got to hang up, get into a new Zoom room, like things like that. Where it's just like, oh man, there's so much. There's just a lot of the corporate structure that is like, it feels like the Wild West here at times, but there's still a corporate structure there that like means that you're not going to get away with fraud for very long, or that like Google and Facebook kind of can't allow that stuff too much, because if they do, it's like going to hurt their entire business model, right? Where like, and like all of that just goes out the window. And then even from like cultural differences with like the types of rides, like we had to do a lot of just different creative, like much more loud, crazy characters, like that type of stuff worked way better and differently there, a lot more out of home, like those types of things.
Can I ask, final one for a quick fire? Is CAC not totally bullshit? And what I mean by that is, like, you have no idea if my mother signed up to Uber because I told her about it 5 times, or she saw it on a billboard 5 times, or she got my discount code. It may have been any of those that caused her. And so, like, how do you think about the effectiveness, honestly, of CAC to LTV and CAC when measuring effectiveness of channel?
I don't. I agree. I think it's bullshit. I think it's a really, the expectation it's going to be a consistent metric across channels and having like a full view of everything that could be included in that is impossible. Like, it's not unlikely, it's impossible. Like it's impossible to fully attribute all of your channels, let alone like one of your channels, especially with like the walled gardens of Google and Facebook and Apple and all of this stuff now. I do still think CAC is a very efficient input and tool for a media buyer, but ideally that CAC is informed by like a media mix model that's constantly, you're basically just trying to optimize for your confidence in your model, not for perfection. And so like pulling in more data, pulling in more models, pulling in the information from your partners, all of that stuff being fed back into the buyers with we believe that on Facebook a customer's value is $20, go get as many as possible, is the best way to let that team operate, instead of asking them to decipher all of the magic behind the CAC to LTV.
The way I always describe it actually with partners for our media companies is, very bluntly, what's your LTV? We mostly work with large B2B companies, and they say $50,000. And I go, great, okay, so it's $15,000 a month to work with us. So we do a 3-month campaign, it's $45,000. Do we think in 3 months being exposed to 3.5 million people, say, across those months, we will get 1 conversion? That's 1x back. Highly likely, yes. Then it's probably a good deal. Like, you should do it. But if we are doing $1 per user, do we think that we're going to get actually 50,000? Tougher. We probably shouldn't do it. I always think about it as like LTV to audience and probability.
Yeah, I think the one thing you just highlighted is that your B2B larger corporate audience is like enterprise is a lot easier of a puzzle to solve from like a CAC to LTV perspective, whereas like consumer, especially mass consumer, marketplace, etc., just like adds all of this noise and complexity and things like that into it. That from your perspective, from a media perspective, makes perfect sense. But from a buying perspective, if I'm a mobile game, I need to, yeah, you're right. It's going to be hard to like attribute it, but I still need those users. I still need to go buy as many $1 users as humanly possible. Like where am I going to do it? How much? So they still have to make that decision. And so, yeah, I think that generally, I think you're right. Like using CAC and just, spreading it evenly across the business, CAC to LTV, I think is our third trap of the
Final one, I promise. You also an active angel investor. You've invested in some fantastic companies. I think we've even got a few together. But how has investing changed your mindset towards growth, now working with many different companies and founders?
So the thing I love about investing is that because I'm working with the founder with an expectation of how to scale this, a venture scale to this, I get pulled into what I think of as like the existential problems of the business, not the day-to-day operational problems. Whereas when I go and I'm consulting or advising, I inevitably like get pulled into like, hey, what's the next channel we should be doing and things like that. And like I talked about earlier, more often than not, I find that like most of the company's problems aren't that they haven't found the channel that's going to work for them. It's actually that they don't have product market fit, or that they're pointed in the wrong direction, or they're too narrow in like how they've solved their problem or things like that. And so I think being able to both tie that existential opportunity with what are the operational asks that they're giving to their teams right now has just been really rewarding for me. And I think helps me think those big picture thoughts and ground them to like, okay, here's what to go hand your team to go find what they're looking for right now. So that's kind of how it shifted my ability to do both kind of ends of that spectrum.
Adam, I could talk to you all day, but sadly you're busy with me. So I've got a quick fire round for you. So I say a short statement. So, okay, what did you believe about growth 5 years ago that you no longer believe?
That everybody needs a growth team.
That really true. Honestly, when you said that at the beginning, I was like, right, fuck the schedule. Good. Why is Explore on Twitter so bad? And what would you do if you were CMO growth at Twitter?
So like for me, it's just become all sports, and I have lots of interests. I like sports, but like it just keeps showing me the one thing. I think they have over-indexed on what they think ads will like versus indexing towards like time relevance, which I think is like the superpower of Twitter, is that like it's exactly what's happening in this moment. And so if I was a growth leader at Twitter, I would be like, how do we really capture that magic of like, this is special right now more than this is special because it's like the generic thing that person likes.
Clubhouse, how do you evaluate what happened? Like what was the magic and what went wrong?
So product market fit on both answers. So I think they had just killer product market fit. The vision initially was, how do we create this feeling of like a dinner party, and those types of conversations in that moment, everybody needed that. But very quickly, like most people don't need that ever. We talked about frequency. Most people want that like once a month, not every single day, but they opened it up so quickly to that. And then the product shifted, or the market shifted, where that product market fit doesn't quite fit there. And this is what a lot of consumer companies are going through right now, where like they think that like, oh, they got to keep trying new things, but really like they don't have product market fit the way they used to in the middle of like a bear market or a bull market.
Does TikTok die? And how do you think about that in terms of what it does? Because I'm seeing so much diversification of channel spend from Facebook and Google to TikTok from brands. Does TikTok die?
I don't think TikTok dies. I think it like
gets banned.
Yeah, I think they've carved their customers out. I think you're gonna still people ebb and flow between them, but just like Snapchat before it, I think.
But you don't think they'll get banned?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that there's too much of a single generation that uses that app that would go crazy if it disappeared.
What would you say is the biggest mistake founders make when hiring growth teams?
I'm trying to think of one I haven't already said. Hiring a growth team. I think it's hiring because they need growth rather than hiring because they have growth.
I agree. It's when they think it's a silver bullet to product market fit, and it's like, no, you just don't have people that like it.
Yep.
Penultimate one. You're great at choose your skill. Why do other people fail at said skill?
I'm great at connecting the dots. Like I've had a lot of exposure, like we talked about. I studied improv and comedy my whole life, and so I love this idea of like the yes and like connecting pieces. And I find that really effective, like in the weeds with founders, because I'm able to like not just think about their singular vision, but really connect it to different consumer experiences, different products, things like that. And I think a lot of people get way too pigeonholed into, I have to solve this. It's a new problem. I can't learn anything from anyone else. I got to go do it myself.
Final one. What one company growth strategy have you been most impressed by recently?
I love Epic Games. I think that like they're both building a platform with Unreal Engine and building the best games to be on that platform. Just reminds me a lot of Apple with the App Store early on, and I think we're starting to see some versions of that with the AI companies hitting the market right now as well. And that's that to me is the closest to like winner take all opportunities, is you building both the platform and some of the best products on it. And so I've actually been like really geeking out about some of their strategies within that.
Adam, I've absolutely loved this. Thank you so much for ruining my schedule, but then being so flexible to go off that shit schedule. And I've loved this discussion. So thank you so much.
Ditto. Absolutely. It's a pleasure, Harry. We'll chat soon.
You're amazing, man.